Indeed, welcome back to Good Morning Kenya. This is Entertainment Thursday. My name is Mike Megui. We move yet to another conversation that is about agricultural journalism, policy and innovation, given that Kenya is preparing to host the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists Congress for the first time in history. And in studio, I'm joined by Steve Wablo, who is the president of International Federation of Agricultural Journalists. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike.
And also Agan Daniel, who is the Secretary of Media for Environment and Science Agriculture. Welcome.
Thank you, Mike.
Karibu sana.
Thank you.
Now, let me start with you, Wablo. Why Kenya?
Kenya is really exciting for us. There's so much agriculture here. There's so much innovation. It's such a hub for research and I guess entrepreneurship. And so to be able to bring our group for the first time to East Africa is exciting from a journalist perspective. It's exciting from a chance to look at agriculture, and it's especially exciting for our African colleagues. We have 60 countries represented in IFAJ. Many of them are in Africa, and to be able to bring our African colleagues to a country where the visa requirements are open, it's accessible, they can bring home stories to their farmers and their policy people is especially exciting to us, as well as bringing the rest of the world here to see the kinds of innovation and agricultural diversity there is in Kenya.
Yes. Daniel, agriculture contributes greatly to the nation's GDP, and this year's Congress will have a special emphasis on tea and flowers. Why?
Okay, thank you. I mean, let's look at it in terms of the rural versus urban agriculture in Kenya. And I would tell you that about 70% of our people who participate in farming are from the rural areas. And if you look at tea, you look at coffee, you look at those kind of crops, this is where our lifeline actually stands. So it's important that this comes into perspective, and given the fact that wherever you go, people would want to taste the Kenyan tea.
Yes.
You know, when you are just within the country, you might not know how much sweet our tea is. But just get outside the borders, just cross the borders, and then you realize that our tea really means a lot to a lot of people in the world. It's also important to realize that over 40% of our people from who do not stay in rural areas actually depend on agriculture. And so it's important that this story is told in a way that we put into perspective issues of tea, issues of coffee, and issues of crops that are really, really important in the export realm. So basically, that makes a great conversation to a lot of people. We've had inquiries about people saying, we hope that when we come to Kenya, we are going to visit tea farms. Many times we take those tea farms for granted, but there are a lot of people who would, just want to say, how is this tea grown? Where is it? How? I mean, what are some of the challenges? Will Kenya still be growing tea 50 years down the line? Yeah.
And when you talk about agricultural journalism, and matters to do with agriculture, we're talking production, markets, and everything. So how does it help in shaping these innovations and policy? Steve?
So agricultural journalists play an important role in terms of being a conduit for knowledge transfer to the field, right? Farmers, whether they're hearing it on broadcast, whether they're reading it in a magazine or a newspaper, whether now they're getting it through digital media, they need this information. They need to know, how do I do a better job? How do I adapt to a changing climate? How do I produce more profitably so that I can be both economically sustainable as well as environmentally sustainable? But the other direction that information flows through agricultural journalists is up from the field. So policymakers, consumers, research organizations can set their agendas and understand how their decisions and how their policies, et cetera, are affecting people in the field. So it's a two-way conduit. that I think really enhances the idea of innovation and I hope inspires people to innovate.
Daniel, what about the perception of the rural life? Does it contribute to that? Changing of perception?
In terms of?
In terms of, now we are looking at agricultural journalism, and
Yes.
Agriculture does not happen in towns.
That's true.
And there's perception of rural life and urban life.
Yeah.
Where does the agricultural journalism play? How does it enhance or change of perception about rural life?
Yeah. Yeah, I guess in Kenya most of the times when somebody calls you shamba, so to speak, they think that it is this thing that is actually not on vogue.
Yeah.
They think that, you know, there's a little bit of some backwardness or that kind of stuff. But I want to tell you that without the rural economy, agriculture would not survive in a country like Kenya. As I said, 70% of the rural man or the rural woman is involved in agriculture. And for that reason, even issues of land are becoming very sensitive. Why so? It's given the fact that we get a lot of our farming activities in the rural areas. And even if you look at Nairobi, for example, a lot of people are now moving away from the city center to go and stay away from the city center so that they do farming. Early in the morning, you know, places that people never thought that people would be staying in. They're moving more into the rural area so that they can also do farming. And agriculture is becoming more important than it was when we were younger. So the perception is that if you really want to make it big, then you have to look for land in far-flung areas away from the big cities.
Yeah. Steve, do you think the way the media takes agricultural stories, do they tend to take a back burner as opposed to more sensational stories?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Mike, because we face that through IFAJ. We hear that from our colleagues quite a lot. You know, oh, my editor, my program manager isn't interested in agricultural stories. And one of the things we're really trying to emphasize in the agricultural journalism community is that agricultural stories touch all kinds of themes. So it's not just how do you grow more tomatoes, or, you know, how do you protect a tea crop from a particular pest or disease. It's also, where's your food come from? You know, what's the food culture? What are the foodways here? What's the effective policy on the ground? What's the economic impact of agriculture? How do changing trade relationships affect farmers? How do farmers affect those trade relationships? So agricultural journalism touches so many elements of things that so many elements that people both in the countryside and in the city are actually really tied to, and we're really trying to create a recognition that agricultural journalism touches so many different pages in the newspaper or segments on television or spots on radio that, you know, it's integral to every aspect of a country.
Daniel, what about the aspect of that most media outlets take a commercial aspect? Has that really contributed to agricultural stories taking a backseat?
Mike, perhaps you wanted to say that most of our media are actually big on politics, you know. Yeah, and of course, I mean, as a journalist, you know that your story will get spiked if there's a commercial that comes in.
Yeah.
So the commercials also help run the stations and, you know, that kind of stuff. But I'm telling you that when we are looking at agricultural stories, then agricultural stories are also actually intertwined with business stories, because there's no single agricultural story that you'll do that does not have the business element of it. And again, there is no single agriculture story that you will do that is isolated from issues of policy and even issues of innovation. These things are so much intertwined that many times people, you know, think that when you do an agricultural story, actually you are doing, you know, like a complete, a complete story that you're telling. And I would also let you know that agricultural stories are becoming more interesting, given the fact that we are now able, to look at things that are coming up that were not there before. For example, what kind of forms do we tell our stories to ensure that you tantalize that politician, you tantalize that commercial person who would like to see a reflection of their work in the stories that we do. So I think that with the kind of competence that we have around here in Kenya, and actually the reason that the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists looked at the competence in which our journalists do cover agricultural stories, they know that agriculture is being given space in the media, and the space that is being given is just not enough. And so it's incumbent upon us as journalists to ensure that we tell those stories that would ensure that the commercials actually do not, elbow us away from the scene. They don't take our space, and neither do they take our, role in terms of the stories that we actually tell.
Still on you, Daniel.
Yeah.
The correlation between agricultural stories and climate change. Yeah. Talk about that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So now, basically, when you look at agriculture, which happens in an environment which is being impacted by climate change, then you need to look at, I come from a seed sector in terms of my communication, and the seed sector itself has been really impacted on by climate change. So that basically means that scientists, particularly here in Kenya, are now working on what we call climate smart crops. Because we like it, we don't like it. Climate change is here with us, and it's affecting us every day. And so we need to be ahead of the changes that, the negative changes that climate is having on our agricultural systems. And so a lot of work is being done here in Kenya, and Steve alluded to it, that if you look at Nairobi alone, the enormous number of research institutes that are trying to work towards ensuring that Africa is fed is big, and they're doing such wonderful work. What we realized this week when we were talking to a lot of organizations is that no single institution is doing their work without the element of addressing climate change.
Yes.
Yep.
Now, as a president of IFAJ, what would you say are the biggest challenges that agricultural journalists face in covering agriculture, innovations, and policies on the same?
Sure. So worldwide, whether you're talking about really well-resourced countries or countries with limited resources, we're looking at shrinking media. We're looking at media where not everybody is a trained journalist anymore. You can be your own media now online, and that means you can have really talented people coming into the media space with a lot of stories to tell and a lot of perspectives to share. But there's also a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding, perhaps even disinformation. That's a challenge. There's the resources it takes to get out into the countryside and report. I mean, we have colleagues in DRC, for instance, who physically can't get to the stories because it's too dangerous. There's also the issues of, the cost, the resources it takes to be out in the field. There's what you referred to earlier, where agricultural stories don't necessarily get the space that they deserve or a share of the media voice. And so if you take that and a shrinking media, they kind of add up to limited opportunities. So what we're trying to do is emphasize the standards of good journalism, emphasize great storytelling, and that's one of the things IFAJ really tries to accomplish, is helping journalists get to the stories and then helping them learn and practice telling the stories better. We share a lot of information with each other on best practices and stimulate that thinking that makes for better storytelling. And hopefully at the end of the day, that earns the space and the credibility that a professional storyteller, professional journalist can bring to its audiences.
Daniel, do we have journalists who are willing to take up agricultural stories?
Okay, before I answer that question, may I also just add one or two things about some of the challenges that journalists actually have in covering agricultural stories. We are still trying to bridge the gap between scientists, researchers, and journalists. Many times the researchers are a little bit shy to speak to journalists, and in instances where they come out to speak to us, one thing that is very common is the use of very technical language that the journalist might sometimes, miss. And that brings in a problem. There are also some little problems, petty problems, like I was misquoted and what have you, but that just speaks to, about issues of professionalism. So those are some challenges that we as the Media for Environment, Science, Health and Agriculture measure are really trying to, address, because your question is that are there journalists who are just doing agriculture? If there were no journalists who are just doing agriculture, then the International Federation of Agricultural Journalists would not exist, because this is a team or a group of journalists who do nothing but write about agriculture. The Media for Environment, Science, Health and Agriculture is also an association of journalists who do agriculture, who specialize on agriculture, health, environment, and name it. And so there's a cadre of journalists who have dedicated themselves to just telling agricultural stories. What we really think needs to happen to this cadre of journalists is they need more training in the face of a lot of dynamics that we are currently experiencing. One of them being innovations. Now we are talking about AI. How would me, for example, as a specialized journalist, keep up with the pace of artificial intelligence? How would I keep up with the modern ways of telling stories? The other thing would be that this group of journalists also need to be facilitated, and they need to be motivated. Being a journalist, you know that it becomes very, very difficult for you maybe to survive without funding. And so the group of journalists who usually tell stories on agriculture usually have got that issue, that problem of who is there for us. Agriculture stories have to be told, and they have to be told using a lot of support. Doing a single agriculture story is not as easy as doing a single story from a political rally. It takes a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of research, a lot of soul searching, a lot of maneuvering with the scientists to get them to speak to you. You have to speak to the farmers so that you can tell the stories. So this is a very expensive affair. But as I said, there's a group of journalists who have just decided that to them, what matters is telling the agriculture stories. And Mike, for that reason, we are going to have the World Congress of Agricultural Journalists coming to Kenya, where we are going to speak agriculture. We are going to speak agriculture journalism. We are going to speak policies on agriculture. We are going to speak about innovation. We are going to speak about how do we partner to ensure that we tell the agriculture, the African agriculture story, and in our case, the Kenyan agriculture story, in a way that is compelling, in a way that is tantalizing, and in a way that can actually help bring in more investments into this country. Yep.
Now, Steve, what opportunities are we looking at once we get into this agricultural space and tell stories that farmers can relate to?
I would say there's immense gratification in going to a farm and hearing someone say, I read this story once that got me going on this crop, or I decided to start rotation or adopt conservation practices because of something I read in the media or I heard on the radio or I saw on television. So that is gratifying. I think on a macro level, opportunities are when agriculture succeeds, a culture succeeds, a country succeeds. Here in Kenya, you've got, as Agan said, 70% of the population engaged directly in agriculture. So a rising agricultural tide will lift a lot of boats. And even in countries like mine, in the US, where we have 2% of the population doing agriculture, rural communities depend on the success of those businesses. Urban communities that are moving those products, processing those products, there's a lot of jobs associated with it, and we all have to eat. I mean, 3 times a day, we have to say thank you, farmers, and at the tied to that is thank you to the people who are sharing the information, whether they're the journalists that are telling the stories or the sources that trust us with the stories, the researchers, the suppliers of products and innovation, and ultimately the farmers who trust us to tell their stories.
How can journalists participate in this upcoming Congress?
They would be members of a national guild that's a member of IFAJ. So for instance, they'd be a member of MESHA or any of our other 59 guilds around the world.
Yeah.
And then they would be most welcome to be here in Nairobi in October to, as Agan said, share ideas, share innovations, network, and hear about all of the dynamic things that are happening here in Kenya.
Let me take your final words.
Yeah. Now, Mike, before maybe my final word is that how would journalists participate in this Congress, which Steve has articulated. But as I said, to him that much is given, yes, much is also expected. I think this is an opportunity for organizations that occupy agriculture space in Kenya to sponsor, support journalists to attend this once-in-a-lifetime Congress. The Congress has been there for 58 years. It has only come to Africa twice. This is the third time that it is coming. So for every agriculture journalist, the people that they have been writing their stories about, this is the time now, it's payback time. The other thing I want to say as my parting shot is that agriculture is the present and the future of any country. And therefore, when it comes to communicating issues of agriculture, yes, we need to stay there and tell those stories. Because if we don't tell them, and that's our work, that's our basic work as a journalist, if we don't tell those stories, nobody else will tell them. And for every agricultural story that you don't tell, or for every health story that you don't tell, you are not saving a life. Okay. That basically means for every agriculture story that you tell, for every health story that you tell, you are saving a life. The Congress brings in that opportunity to continue saving lives. Okay.
Steve, your final words.
Just that we as IFAJ are very eager and excited to be coming to Kenya. We'll be bringing 150 to 200 agricultural journalists from around the world together here. I think the energy is great. I think the welcome, I mean, the fact that every conversation starts with Karibu tells us something about Kenya. And we're delighted to be able to be here. We're looking forward to working with the journalists, the sponsors, the farmers, and really making this an unforgettable opportunity.
Thank you. Steve Webler, who is president of International Federation of Journalists, and also Agan Daniel, who is the Secretary of Media for Environment, Science and Agriculture, talking to us about agricultural journalism policy and innovation and the upcoming IFAJ Congress later in the year. This is where we end this conversation. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Mike Megwe. Vivian Ndegwa is up next with Entertainment Thursday. Stay with us.